Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the community conversation this evening. I'm the Reverend Mary Margaret Earl, and I'm the Executive Director at the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry. Happy to be here with my colleague, Monique Marshall-Veal. The Urban Ministry is a very old social justice nonprofit in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, and we are proud to do work through the decades to advance justice. And this is one of the ways that we do that. And I'd love for Monique to tell you a little bit more about the history of our community conversations.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Good evening, everyone. For many of you who have been with us over the last 4 years, and for those who are just joining us, our community conversations have highlighted the history, art, and experiences of Black and Indigenous people of color. These conversations have provided an opportunity to raise awareness around some of the issues that plague residents of color in Boston neighborhoods. These conversations also provide information on how to support organizations in their work to help people of color. And tonight's conversation is about fighting the fight for homeownership with folks from UU Mass Action and Homes for All Massachusetts. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for our conversation.
And before we begin, we wanted to share a commitment minute, which is the voice of one of our member congregations talking about why they support the work of the urban ministry. And I'm so proud to share now some words from my colleague, the Reverend Jeff Barsnell of the Weston congregation, talking about the importance of housing justice. So here are some inspiring words from Reverend Jeff.
Hey there, I am Jeff Barsnell, the minister of First Parish Church in Weston. I am a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a dog owner, and I am a renter myself. We here in Weston are delighted to be sponsoring tonight's community conversation. As a longtime supporter of the urban ministry and a more recent member of UU Mass Action, First Parish Weston realizes that the best approach to addressing inequality and improving access to decent housing involves regional work and advocacy. Since the pandemic, I receive calls on a regular basis from local agencies and families looking for assistance. Most of the requests I receive are from single working moms with one or a few kids trying desperately to stay in the apartment where they've been living. I yearn to live in a state and in a region where access to decent housing is not a privilege for some, but a reality for many. I want to thank our presenters for sharing with us their work and helping each of us to become better advocates. I also want to invite all of you to pay attention to the current bills at the State House that might make a difference. This work is not easy, and it will not be done overnight, but it is worthy of our time, our energy, and our resolve. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you, First Parish Weston. So in addition to our community commitment minutes, we have also taken time to highlight and promote small business owners of color. And tonight we are showcasing a 60-second highlight of Live Like a Local, owned by Colin Knight. So as you are thinking about places to visit, products and services to purchase, please remember the small businesses that we've promoted over the last few years. Thank you.
Sorry, the sound didn't come through in that video, but please go to livelikealocaltours.com. You can see that brief and compelling video of the great work that Colin Knight does in his business and support it. So before we get moving forward with our conversation, I wanted to say that this evening's community conversation tonight is in honor of Tony Rodriguez. Tony was a board member and a longtime friend of the UU Urban Ministry. And before that, he also had served as president of the UU Mass Action Board, and he was a pillar of First Parish in Concord. A graduate of MIT, Tony worked in information technologies in the financial sector for many years. Perhaps more importantly, he was deeply committed to social justice. He volunteered in the Hispanic community in East Boston, teaching math, English, and civics. And he worked as a volunteer advocate for immigrant families released from detention centers and living in the Boston area. He was a gentle and kind person, and he found a lot of joy in the midst. No one would have been happier to know that two organizations he loved and served, the UU Urban Ministry and UU Mass Action, were partnering tonight in service of justice. And so we are so glad to share this conversation in his memory. Thank you for everything, Tony. So I just wanted to remind the audience that as you listen to tonight's conversation and think of questions that you might have, you can start putting them together, or even entering them in the chat as we go, and we'll save a little bit of time at the end to ask our guests your questions. So we're going to now introduce our panelists.
Thank you. And I have the honor of introducing Tali Smookler. She is the Congregational Organizing Director at UU Mass Action. Previously, she worked at a Jewish social justice organization called Join for Justice. At UU Mass Action, she co-leads UU Mass Action's UU Youth Corps and Immigration Justice Team and Housing Justice Campaign. As part of her work, she builds relationships with congregational leaders and engages them in statewide campaigns.
I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, the Reverend Jo Murphy, who is the Executive Director for UU Mass Action, and she is busy mobilizing and organizing with the many UU Mass Action campaigns. She is also quite busy with her 10-month-old daughter, Simone, and doing per diem work as a chaplain at Beth Israel. She also loves liberation, dreaming, and the ocean. Welcome, Reverend Jo.
And I will introduce now Carolyn Chou, who's the Executive Director of Homes for All Massachusetts, a statewide coalition of tenant organizing and housing justice organization. She builds the power of tenants and working class homeowners to advocate for policies to keep them in their homes and stabilize their communities. Previously, she was Executive Director of the Asian American Resource Workshop and helped to build Dorchester Not for Sale, bringing together a diverse set of neighborhood residents to fight for good jobs, affordable housing, and equitable planning. Carolyn is a queer mixed-race Chinese American organizer living in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. Welcome to all of our panelists for tonight.
Welcome, everyone. Hey. We're happy to have you here, and we're excited to get right to it. So first, I wanted to start with a basic question, which is how did UU Mass Action start working with Housing for All, and why was it important to you to support the work? Maybe Tali, maybe you want to start there.
Sure, thank you. I just want to start off with also, I personally work with Tony, and I'm really glad to be here in his honor tonight.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm Tali. I use she and her pronouns, and I imagine many of you are familiar with UU Mass Action, but to answer that question, I just want to ground us in who UU Mass Action is.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So our mission is to organize UUs in Massachusetts to confront oppression. And we do this by organizing and building power and creating opportunities for UUs across the state to support campaigns led by our frontline partner organizations. Frontline partners meaning organizations with people and communities who are most impacted by the issues that we are working on. And so that is really important and critical for our relationship with Homes for All Massachusetts, which is a very frontline-led coalition. And so we had been loosely connected with Homes for All through actually some of our climate work initially, because there were some intersections with housing and climate. But it wasn't until winter 2022 that we really kind of dug into this relationship and explored the potential. So that winter, I think it was 2022, correct me if I'm wrong. We were approached by Homes for All Massachusetts about an action that they wanted to host in the Housing Chairs District. And that was in a wealthier area of the state. And so Homes for All, which is largely more frontline folks, didn't have as many people there, but we had 3 congregations there, 3 UU congregations. And so it felt like this really great opportunity and example of what does it mean to do solidarity. Like, we have this strategic resources, we have congregations, we have local presence through ministers, and we have a space there. And thinking about how can we really show up for these partners that were asking for our support in that moment. And so we ended up working with them to plan this action. We connected them to one of the congregations there that hosted the action in their parking lot. The minister from that congregation spoke there and led a blessing. We were there kind of shoveling sidewalks for the march because it was a very snowy day. And it just felt like a really powerful example of like, what does it mean for UUs to show up in solidarity with frontline organizations? Knowing that there's diversity within UU communities, but UU Mass Action is largely a solidarity organization. And so this kind of kickstarted a lot of our work with Homes for All Massachusetts. We started organizing more in that district, ultimately leading to a meeting with the chair of the housing committee, which to my knowledge, I think had not happened. They had not been able to get a face-to-face meeting at that point. And so we were really able to leverage our power as UUs to show up for housing justice in relationship with frontline communities who are most impacted by housing issues. And so that kind of started our work. And since then, we've been connecting more in different ways, largely through actually our youth work. We've been working with a high school youth corps that we started, and they've talked to their legislators about rent control. They've learned a lot about housing justice, and it's been really powerful to see how youth really approach this issue and realize the crisis that we're in and understand it. And so, yeah, we really partner with Homes for All because they're really led by frontline groups. They're a powerful coalition with many, many organizations from across the state. And they're really grounded in trying to change the systems to prevent people from facing housing insecurity, and really trying to get to the root cause of that by working on advocacy and changing laws, and also showing up in the moment when there are current crises that people are facing. So that's a little bit of our partnership. There's more we could share, but I'll pause there. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else.
I think that was good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
So I will jump in with the next question if anyone would like to answer this, maybe Joe. Can you talk a little bit about how housing connects with other social justice issues?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that question. I also wanted to quickly say, I also got to work with Tony, mostly actually in Beyond, and he was such a gentle but strong and active soul, and it was so lovely to work alongside him. He was also the one who offered me this job.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So,
many warm feelings. But yeah, back to the question of how is housing connected with social justice issues? Not to be that cheesy person, but which ones are it not connected to? Because I really think, yeah, it really connects to a lot. I think that's, in part, people having a house that is a home that is affordable and gives shelter and refuge and people what they need is empowering people to have dignity and to empower themselves to build loving, rich, functioning community. If people have places to rest and shelter, and I would say housing, it should be and is in my heart a human right. And also it, of course, in an obvious way, perhaps relates to economic development. Affordable housing often spurs sustainable economic development, giving communities, a range of economic opportunities. Investing in affordable housing creates jobs and supports business growth. It can often increase tax revenues for public services. So it has a clear economic development drive. Sort of coupled with that is the racial justice component, with racial justice systems such as redlining, gentrification, and just outright discrimination. A lot have housing relates to racial justice in this way. And I would say coupled with that is, again, community wellness. In this way, we're not creating good, rich communities that draw on everyone's strength and that include everyone. And that I think really affects us as a people and community. Many studies have been done about people having safe and secure housing, lowers crime rates and lowers arrests and less people going to prison, lowering rates of incarceration in general. And we also know that, of course, housing issues arise after people are incarcerated and get out. So in this way, housing definitely relates to decarceration efforts, perhaps abolition, put it out there. And as Tali briefly mentioned, housing relates to the environment. We all know that when cities are built up, urban sprawl leads to pollution, issues of water supply, and also that missed opportunity where there's an opportunity to create more sustainable, environmentally friendly housing, with affordable housing, with housing in general. So I would say that's a brief summary of some of the issues that housing really deeply connects to.
Yeah, it's hard to, if you don't have a place to live, it's hard to think about do anything else, right? Or do anything else. I mean, it's just the bottom line. We can imagine it for ourselves. And it is connected to everything. And I wanted to kind of turn now to Carolyn, and the work that you do. And I want to just back up a bit. This series, this season has focused entirely on housing justice and housing issues. And we've looked, back with Byron, kind of Byron Rushing, creating historical context. We've been talking to different people about the different policies and plans, about how we can change things over time. And there's some ways in which what you're speaking up for is like right now, we also have to do stuff today, right now. Because a lot of the solutions are longer term and they're important, but there's also stuff we need to do today. And one of the things that you talked with us in advance of this was some of the work that you're doing in rent control. And I wondered if you could, people, rent control is kind of a headline, but not everybody really understands its history. I wonder if you would talk about what your organization is trying to do regarding rent control, and maybe kind of make it a little bit more personal for us about what are some ways that on the ground you've seen individuals whose lives are impacted and why you think we need to think about rent control.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mary Margaret, and good to be with everyone. And thanks, Talia and Joe, for all that framing, right? That really brings us to the work we're doing in this moment. I think just to start off, Homes for All Massachusetts, we are not like a rent control campaign organization. We are really an organization of folks working on the ground with tenants, low-income homeowners, people facing eviction and foreclosure, right? BIPOC communities, to imagine a different housing system in Massachusetts. Because, as Joe was laying out, right, the system is not working for people, right? There's a reason that housing is the #1 issue across the Commonwealth. And it's because our current system of housing that's for profit, not for people, is not serving the needs of anyone, and particularly of, BIPOC and working class communities. And so Homes for All really has big visions around what would it look like to have a different housing system where land is decommodified, where, right, we have truly affordable housing for all. And as you said, Mary Margaret, a lot of the solutions take time, right? And we know that the people who are facing the brunt of the crisis we're experiencing right now are low income people of color renters, right? That's who's facing the brunt of the crisis. So, we have a long-term vision. Obviously, other folks in the state you've heard from have other visions that may or may not intersect with us. But what we're clear about exactly is that we also need to keep folks here now, right? Because these are our communities and these are the folks who deserve to be part of building that future. And if there's anything the kind of migrant crisis and the shelter crisis has unveiled for us, it's that we already had a crisis, right, within our shelter system, that many people have been on wait lists for far too long. And now we are intersecting it with, international crisis, right? Migrants coming here, and now folks are getting pitted against each other instead of understanding that we actually need to build a different system. And we need to make sure that more of our folks here in Massachusetts are not being forced into shelter, which then frees up more shelter space for people coming, right? And we think that rent control and, just cause of it, like eviction protections and other things that go along with rent control are ways to do that, right? To stabilize people and to keep them in their communities. So, as you all probably know, rent control has been a dirty word in Massachusetts politics for far too long. We had rent control in Boston, Somerville, Brookline, and Cambridge in 1976. Yes, and then we then for many years after that, Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge had rent control until the statewide referendum to ban municipal rent control in 1994. And since then, I think we've seen what's happened and how destabilizing that's been to tenants in those communities and across the state. And so, in the past period, I think the crisis has gotten to a place where folks are willing to engage in the conversation politically around rent stabilization again. And so, we are putting it forward as a key piece of housing policy that supports tenants now. For us, the kind of rent control policy we're advocating for has a clear cap, so a clear amount that rents can go up a year and that it can't be that much, right? We're saying somewhere around 5% as a cap. We're also making sure there's just cause eviction so that there have to be reasons for landlords to evict, because otherwise, right, you might have rent control, but if you don't have the just cause eviction, then the landlords can just evict folks and then raise the rent instead of, raising the rent on the current tenant. And the other key component is something called vacancy control. So making sure that the rent cannot jack up between tenants, that there's a reasonable rate, it can go up between tenants. Again, this is really about making sure we're creating that there's affordable units for families and there's not reason for landlords to push toward evictions or high rent increases. And, we also have exemptions in the policy we're pushing for small landlords, because we know that our communities are built up of renters, homeowners, and small landlords. And we know the real folks who are causing the biggest harm are corporate landlords, investor ownership. As MAPC's recent report shows, we have a crisis of investors and speculators buying up homes across Massachusetts. And, these are really the folks that are jumping the rent 200%, are kicking families out. Right. And our groups on the ground, which include groups like City Life Vita Urbana, New England United for Justice, Springfield No One Leaves, Lynn United for Change, the Asian American Resource Workshop, and Reclaim Roxbury and others, right? They see this every day. Our groups see tenants getting 200% rent increases, we see folks getting, evicted as speculative investors buy properties, right? We also see low income homeowners face foreclosure and then investor owners buying up those foreclosed homes, right? Not giving folks a chance to stay. And so, whether I think some good examples are in Mattapan, there's a building that City Life's organizing where the tenants are working together to fight to stay and actually to buy their building from an investor owner. And same in Air, Massachusetts, there's a large building where folks are doing the same. And it's a day-to-day crisis, right? Just today, I was working with an organizer at the Asian American Resource Workshop in Fields Corner who's just talked to a tenant whose rent doubled, right, last month.
So from what to what? Do you know what it was? Like from what to what? Like from 1,000 to 2,000? Do you know what the dollars were?
Yeah, it was about that, what you're saying. And I mean,
like about 1,000
I don't
to
want to,
2,000.
there's like complications around like, we know in immigrant communities also people cannot afford units. So people are, this is a little to the side of the rent control policy, but we know people are renting rooms, they're sharing rooms with whole families. They're not even able to rent a unit. I mean, that's out of reach. So when I'm talking about 500 to 1,000, something jumping from 500 to 1,000, that's not for an apartment. That's just for a room in an where you also maybe don't have any rights because you're not even the primary tenant, right? So, I mean, people are living in so many really challenging situations because there is no way to get affordable, safe, quality housing in our current system, right, in Massachusetts. I mean, even for young professionals, like I'm sure Tali and Joe and I know, there are so many folks who are not able to not live with 4 roommates, right? Or, whatever else, right? Which may be a choice you want, but also may not be. So I think, we see it across income, but the folks who are bearing the brunt of it are low income, working class BIPOC tenants who are seeing their rents exactly go from 1,200 to 2,400 overnight, or are getting evicted for no cause when investors are buying buildings. So I think on my own block, right, every time a long-time homeowner who has a triple decker here in Dorchester ages out of their home, every house on my block has been bought that's not a single family has been bought by an investor and turned into condos. So any tenants are evicted and then the condos are sold for, I don't know, 700,000, 800,000 each, right? Those units are now no longer even on the rental market, let alone affordable. So I'm kind of digressing, but I think those are some
I don't think it's really important. Yeah.
Those are some of the textures of what we see. And, obviously for the urban ministry in Roxbury, I always think when I drive around Dorchester and Roxbury, you can see the housing flip, right? You can see when the new siding goes up. You can see when the for sale sign goes up. You see what's happening, right? These are investor owners purchasing properties and flipping them into condos. And I guarantee you almost every time tenants are evicted for that to happen, right? So, those are the kinds of things, even if you don't know people in the situation, you can observe what's happening in our neighborhoods. And our communities, they want neighborhoods that are beautiful and have well upkept houses and open space and all of this. But, and new housing and all of that, but it ends up symbolizing that new people are coming and we're going to get priced out of our neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
So we need protections like rent control so that we can actually have conversations about what kind of communities we want to be building and that folks can access those conversations. Because when everything new means the threat that your rent is gonna go up by 200, 500%, like you're not going to be able to engage in a conversation about what kind of neighborhood we're trying to build because
you're working 3 jobs to try to
exactly.
do it. So how do you even find the time to fight for your rights? How do you find the time to fight for any kind of change?
Exactly. So I think, that's just really key, right? We're fighting for stability. We're fighting for stable communities and stable families. And for us, that means, rent control and then foreclosure mediation. So supporting low-income homeowners facing foreclosure, in addition, are two key policies that help us stabilize, that help us even start the conversations about what comes next. And so I think Tali and I will talk more later, but we do have, a bill that's still in committee at the State House, and we really are hoping to build a broad coalition of individuals and organizations who are, fighting for rent control as part of the solution to our very deep and entrenched housing crisis in Massachusetts, but one that will keep, low income, working class, Black and brown folks housed and keep our community stable.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you so
Can I
much.
just add one clarifying? I think
Sure.
you mentioned this, but just to clarify, because I think it can get confusing. The bill for rent control is not saying that there would be statewide rent control. It's saying that cities and towns can choose if it's right for them. So like the towns that Carolyn mentioned, some of them like Boston already like voted that they want rent control, but currently it is banned for them to do that because of this referendum that happened in 1994. So the bill is not even like as radical as like it could be. It's really just saying like, if your town thinks that's right for them, like, then you can do it. And here are some of the like things that are required to make that happen. So just to say that, like, I think it can be misunderstood a lot of the time of what the bill is actually doing. And it's really just also allowing for like local town and
It's
city.
allowing choice.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, yeah, thanks, Tali. I got distracted and off that key point, but yeah, because I think we believe, right, in local option, and we believe in cities and towns being able to enact this, and we just don't want this to be something that has to go back to the State House. And we're seeing a lot of energy. Somerville just put forward a home rule petition on this. Medford is in discussions on rent control. Obviously, as Tali said, Boston has moved something forward. Brookline moved something forward, right? We're already seeing, even without the conditions where these things can move very easily, cities and towns saying that this is what they want. And I think we just need to create the conditions where folks can do what makes sense for them. And we think of our policy as kind of a framework to make sure that as people are enacting rent control, it's good rent control policy that is meaningful and actually will make sure tenants are able to stay in their homes.
Thank you, both, for all of that history about rent control. And I think there's still, sometimes some misunderstandings about who would benefit from rent control. And I think, that it has an impact on everyone, including those who have secure housing. And could you, Joe, maybe talk a little bit about how rent control does actually impact everyone and not just a small population of folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, house equity really affects us all. Again, as some of the issues I mentioned of how housing connects to all these other issues, like the economy and the environment, affects us all. Carolyn also mentioned, the housing system is set up to be profit over people. And I would say that fuels nothing but racial capitalism, which I would say is toxic for our world and for our souls. And that we don't want anything fueling that. We want space and time to shed, fight, and battle racial capitalism. And I think this is the housing issue, and rent control is one of those things that highlights the profit over people, and it separates us, which as a minister, as an organizer, that's bad. I'm one of those people that think if we solve racism, we'd really end most of injustice. And I think separating us gives white people like me space to continue to be racist. And we need to live in community with each other. We need to, as Carolyn said, have space to dream about what our communities look like. And to me, that's not separated communities, that's not separated by class or race. Or I forgot I didn't even mention immigration as an issue that clearly affects, that clearly relates to housing inequity. And that also affects our communities of who is able to come in and get secure housing and who is not. And then I think just in a wider arc of how rent control and housing equity affects us is it is better for us all to have control of the communities we live in, and to be able to provide for each other. And it's very hard to provide for each other when we are separated off, when housing is good housing is what you get when you have a lot of money. And I would say also, the issue of how does this affect people that are housing secure? And I would say also this issue, housing has gotten so nuts that people that are house secure are a lot closer to being not secure, as we've sort of all touched on, that the housing market, renting, everything, especially in the Boston area. My housemates and I do a lot of hosting of immigrant families when they first arrive. And we tell them when they get here and they tell us their plans. And if they don't have family or friends or acquaintances here, we say, get out of Boston, go to Rhode Island, go to any other state, just keep driving out of Boston because it is so hard to make enough money to pay for a good, secure, safe, again, as Carolyn mentioned, not even house. We're talking about a room in an apartment. A family we just hosted that had parents and 3 kids finally were able to, as of now, rent a studio apartment for a family of 5. And they both have jobs now. Again, everyone should have a safe, secure house that is a home. But even people who are gainfully employed, you have to be really making a lot of money to do that. And I think that affects everyone and how we construct and live within our communities and how close or how much closer a lot of people with secure housing are close to insecure housing.
Thank you.
I wonder if a lot of the work of the urban ministry is shining light on the history of racism and racial injustice. And I wondered, Carolyn, if you could talk about how you see rent control as a racial justice issue.
Yeah, I think about organizing tenants as a racial justice issue kind of across the board, right? We know that the people most impacted by this crisis are Black and Brown communities and individuals, right? From the foreclosure crisis of 2008 to the current rental crisis. We just see that Black communities, Black and Brown BIPOC communities are the hardest hit by all of this, right? And as kind of Karen's question in the chat says, and are often the first to get reinvestment, right? And to end up being gentrified. So communities the communities that built them are no longer able to stay. So, to me, I think about it in terms of like, how do we keep Black and Brown communities here in Massachusetts? We have to make sure people can stay in their homes and don't just give up and leave. How do we make sure we're welcoming new Black and Brown communities, right? Like we see with the migrants, and making sure we have housing and tenants' rights that actually work for people coming into the housing market. And then, there's been a lot of discourse around home ownership as an important gap to close in Black communities. And one thing I think we often miss is that people having affordable rental units is the way folks are able to stabilize themselves and save money, right? So when you're, for some people, home ownership will always be out of reach because of our economic system and the lack of access to high paying jobs. But even for folks who do have access to higher paying jobs, actually that things that stabilize people's rent allow people to save and stabilize so that they can potentially access homeownership in the future. So I see it from like the migrants coming into the shelter system tomorrow to the tenants who live in, predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods and are seeing investors come in and are seeing their rents doubled, right? As we talked about, are getting evicted out, to the folks who are more stable but cannot afford to save for home ownership because of the amount they have to pay for rent. Across the board, right? We need policies that stabilize people's rental housing so that we can stabilize Black and brown communities. And so, I think we often talk about, these are broad policies, right, that support everyone. But we know, just as the crisis has hit Black communities the hardest, we know that these solutions that focus on working class communities, that focus on low income tenants, are going to support stabilizing Black communities.
Thank you. And I'm just thinking about our previous community conversations and the many perspectives that have been raised about housing justice. One of them being affordable housing. A lot of them will take time, but it's something that we need right now. And I think we're kind of at a crossroads, but what are some of the things that we can do right away to help, address this issue?
Yeah, I think we are at a crossroads, Monique. I think that's totally right. And we're seeing folks get pushed further and further out of Boston. We're seeing folks get pushed out of the state, right? We're seeing just like a total crisis of the system, right? Even if I was just talking to someone, I was like, well, at all costs, that person needs to avoid getting evicted because they are not going to be able to get into shelter. Like, you cannot even, if you get evicted tomorrow, you cannot even access shelter beyond any other barrier because our shelter system was already in crisis and now is also kind of absorbing the migrant crisis. So we already had 3,000 families in the EA shelter system, which is only for families. So that we're not even talking about single people before, the latest surge of migrants. So, I mean, it's just like, it's untenable, right? And I feel that every day, and so many of us do. And I think, it is not all we need to do, but part of what we need to do is tell our state legislature, who chooses to do nothing in the face of crisis after crisis, that we do need all the tools at our disposal. And that means that we need to lift the ban on rent control. I also think it means, whether you live in areas where there is tenant organizing and folks supporting individual cases where people are getting evicted and stopping that, or you live in a area where it's mostly homeowners, but folks are opposing new emergency shelter for migrants, or, people are opposing new affordable housing being built, that we do need to say, we need housing for working class people, and we're going to stand next to people who are getting evicted and stop this crisis. So I encourage folks to get connected, to work on the ground, and also be part of supporting our push at the State House to get them to act. Because although in our State House it feels like no action is ever happening, they could act tomorrow. We could lift the ban on rent control tomorrow if there was political will to do that, right? So we need to both be there with people outside of the political dynamics, and also we need to contend for those and say that this is on the State House to actually address this crisis.
Thank you. I want to give anyone else a chance to chime in if they'd like to.
Yeah, I think also, and Carolyn mentioned this, but at UUMass Action, we do try to push along rallies and things that come up that are situations where you can be in support of renters who are trying to reclaim their building or get lower rent, et cetera, et cetera. So be on the lookout for those opportunities. They happen in a bunch of clearly different areas, and usually always are open to more people joining that fight. And I also want to say, I don't know exactly who's here except for beautiful faces interested in justice. But if you are landlords, if you know landlords, um, that's a lot of power there to be a better landlord, to ask people that are landlords, what are your practices? What is the rent? How do you feel about rent control? Because often landlords are not participating in this fight for rent control. So I would say those two things of, yeah, joining the folks that are reclaiming their buildings and whatnot and getting lower rent, as well as landlords. A lot of power. Find them, know them, and be just.
Excellent. Thank you so much, both of you. And I know that there are a couple of questions coming into the chat, but I also want to just ask this one question kind of as a follow-up, because Carolyn, you touched on it a little bit. And we know that in the neighborhood of Roxbury, there's been a great deal of controversy over the takeover of the Melnia Cass Center for migrants for sheltering. And historically, Roxbury has often been on the receiving end of things and decisions that were made that would never happen in other communities like Back Bay or in Weston even. Carolyn and the rest of the panelists, can you talk a little bit about how you see this issue and the many layers of racial justice and housing issues that are woven into that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Monique. And I think it's important, right, as we talk about Roxbury, to talk about these dynamics. I mean, I think that it is right. We cannot, exactly what you said, we cannot ignore the fact that when a white community says they don't want something, everyone throws their hands up. And when a Black community says they don't want something, it happens anyway. And I think that I see the migrant crisis as a racial justice issue. I mean, in a state like ours, we are predominantly getting Black immigrants and migrants and refugees coming to the Commonwealth. And folks need services that, particularly in places like Roxbury and Mattapan, are the places where they can receive those services, right? Folks like Pastor Kiki and Mattapan are doing like work beyond anyone's imagination in times like this. And I come out of doing immigrant organizing, and we always talk about the importance of immigrant enclaves for being the places where folks can enter, can get services and language, have the cultural connection. And I haven't really heard folks talk about that part, that's like, if we put a bunch of recently arrived Haitian folks in Weston, both Weston needs to do its part toward building more affordable housing for the long term. And when people are coming here, it's actually really hard to be really isolated and to not have anywhere to go. So I think that it's complicated, right, in that way. And I'm glad that Fort Point did not get to say no to getting the next set of beds, as they should, right? And as the city should, where we have public transit, where folks can get to services. Like Boston does have things that Newton and Natick and Weston and, other places don't have, like rapid transit systems where folks can take the train to the health center where they have a Haitian Creole speaking doctor. I mean, those are real things. And it doesn't mean that the process was right. It doesn't mean that the services that were happening at the Cass should have been taken away, and that Black young people should not have had access, that we should not hold the state to commitments for moving forward at the Cass, so that it is actually invested in for the long term, that people are getting that it's being improved in the ways that the community wants. I think we should have those long-term demands. And I also just think like, yeah, it's a place where I think we have to understand the system has failed our people, whether our people are young people who grew up in Roxbury or recent migrants from Haiti. And we have to like show up for each other in the face of a failed system, and we have to push the system to be better for everyone. But I think we cannot allow the system to pit our communities against each other in that way. I think that's not how, we're going to create a new housing system that works for renters, for low-income homeowners, for small landlords, and for, newly arrived migrants with no income. I mean, like I believe all of those folks deserve housing, services, healthcare, and all of that. And I think we just need to work together to be strategic, to push the state to say, okay, this is going to happen now. And here are the 5 demands that we will all hold you to about what we want to see for investment in this community center coming out of this short-term period.
Thanks, Carolyn. We just have a couple of more minutes. We have a few more minutes, and we have a few questions here. So we're going to try to roll through these to get at least to most of them. So Karen has 2 questions, and I'm going to try to combine them. So she thanks you, Carolyn, for all your work at the People's Assemblies, and asked if you can talk about the intersection of improvements of the T, like the Fairmont line, and the dynamic of displacement and raised rents for those who have invested sweat and time equity in these neighborhoods that are now seeing gentrification. And she also asked a follow-up question about how reparations for redlining in Boston could be visualized as equity zoning policies. How can we pair reparations with reachable, affordable housing policies? So 2 things there.
Yeah, good to see you, Karen. We've cut many postcards and done many actions together over the years on this. I think this is one place just on zoning stuff where it actually distinguish what makes sense in working class communities, and BIPOC communities. So whether that's Roxbury, Dorchester, like the city, or, places like Brockton, or other places versus like predominantly white, more affluent suburbs. I think that there's a few things on zoning. I think that white affluent suburbs need to build more housing, including more affordable housing, right? And I think that in our predominantly working class BIPOC communities, that we can't build our way out of the crisis, and we need to make sure that these zoning changes around transit-oriented development and all of these things Karen's referencing don't just build more market rate housing, but actually focus on housing that meets the incomes of the communities, right? So it's kind of like when we talk about fair housing, right? And what's, segregation, like it's a different thing to me when we're talking about segregation in white wealthy communities versus like, what does it mean for communities of color to have self-determination in their communities, right? But sometimes in a legalese fair housing definition, those become the same. So I think to me, it's about, that there are communities where we need to build more housing, particularly affordable housing, but at all income levels. And then there are working class BIPOC communities where we need to say, these are the people who've lived here, and we need to zone to build housing for those people. I think that at the city, there's continuing to be some effort on that, but certainly could be more, Karen. And I think we just want to keep pushing for, like, as Mayor Wu and other folks talk about changing planning and zoning, that we want to see anti-displacement measures at the forefront. And we want to make sure that our communities, our working class communities, can remain in our city. I haven't thought that much about the reparations for redlining, and so I feel like I can't say a lot on that, but I think we're getting toward the same thing around this, equity and zoning policy. And I think it's really important for us to lift up the history of redlining in any conversation about housing.
Great, thank you. And there is a question and a link to an article. And this is coming from Livette. Has anyone defined affordable housing? And then she put a link to a Frontline article, which I think would be great for folks to reference. And then there was another question related to affordable housing, and this comes from Tess. Are there organizations where people can donate or invest in affordable housing?
Yeah, just on the investment one, I mean, I'm happy to share more with anyone and pull some more resources, but one thing that comes to mind is, there's a lot of kinds of affordable housing, as Lavette said, which is more or less affordable. But one thing that's also important to us is community control. So I think community land trusts are a good opportunity for individual support and investment in both preserving affordable housing and in community land trust, the community owns the land and it's either home ownership or rental on top, but it's a way to also have community governance. So I would encourage folks to look at some of the community land trusts in Boston. There's the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network is a great place to start.
And just quickly, if you're part of a UU congregation, maybe you want to think about take back the commons, give up your building. What do we really need? What can we give back?
Well, that's a little seed dropped right there, Reverend Joe. And I want to give the last question. We have one more minute, and I want to turn it over to Reverend Joe and Tali to talk about what people can do in your UU Mass Action Advocacy Day and getting people out to UU Mass Action Advocacy Day. What can people do? Lay it on.
Now's the time?
Now's the time.
Okay, I wasn't sure if there was one other question before. Great. So you're all in luck because if you're like, I really want to support rent control and foreclosure prevention right now, you can, because we have our Advocacy Day coming up on March 26th. Actually, I know a lot of people are off camera, but can I get a little raise of hands if you've been to a UU Mass Action Advocacy Day? Lovely. If you want to write any of your positive experiences in the chat, now's a great time. But it's a day, whether or not you've ever talked to your legislator, made a phone call, sent an email, it's a day where we all come together from across the state virtually, so you don't actually have to go anywhere. And we set up meetings with your legislators where you can talk about issues that are important to you from our priority bills focus. We have 5 issue areas we focus on, but one of them is housing justice. And so it's a really great way if you're looking for how to get involved more, how to learn more, how to connect with other UUs and connect with UU Mass Action, who is connected with Homes for All. It's a really good way to start, or continue to have these conversations and push your legislator about it. It's a really important time because the bill was extended in the committee until I think April 18th, and this is on March 26th. And so they actually really need to be hearing from us now that there is support. So it's an urgent moment. It's a great opportunity. It's fun. It's communal. It's powerful. And so I'm going to share in the chat how to sign up. And if you can't come that day, because we know that it is during the day because that's when legislators are working. So if you can't make it then, I don't know if there's a way I'll share our website, but it'd be great if you could sign up for our newsletter. There's a housing page on our website where we're seeding ideas for starting a housing team. We haven't quite gotten that off the ground, but as we've been building our relationship with Homes for All and as this campaign has been building, there's a lot of appetite for that. So there's ways in an ongoing way to connect with that as well as in this big moment that you can join us. So I'm going to share that in the chat now. And I know we're sort of at time, but if people have any questions, I'm happy to do my best to answer.
Put your email and people can follow up with an email. So we are at time. We try to end at time. It's always good when you end when there's more coming in because it means that people are engaged. So thank you so much, Carolyn Chou, Tali Smookler, Reverend Joe Murphy for being with us tonight and for helping educate us more about rent control and how people can make a difference today for housing justice. And thank you everybody for tuning in. Next month is our last housing community conversation of the season, and it's going to be a youth takeover. Last word, Monique.
Many thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of this evening, and we will see you in April.
See you in April. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night.